Welcome to episode 42 of Forest Focus, brought to you by the USDA Forest Service Pacific Southwest region. Hey folks, if you don't already know or stumbled upon this podcast for the first time, the Pacific Southwest region is made up of the 18 national forests in California, the wonderful state of Hawaii, and the U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands. Another nugget of information you might not have known is our region is home to the Pacific Southwest Research Station. They are part of the Forest Service's Research and Development Organization. R&D operates 5 research stations, a forest products lab, and the International Institute of Tropical Forestry. Yeah, right? I didn't know that either. According to their website, they employ more than 500 scientists, as well as several hundred technical and support personnel located at 67 sites throughout the U.S. That's a heck of a lot of people. In this episode, we are going to take a microscope and hear from just three Pacific Southwest Research Station employees as a way to introduce everyone, including myself, to the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and the how of how our research and development side of things works. Okay, so here we go. I've got my lab coat on. I've got a little profile analysis sheet right here. So first up under the magnifying glass is Francisco Escobedo. All right, so in the beginning of this whole thing, it says Francisco is a research social scientist jointly based out of the Riverside office of the Pacific Southwest Research Station and the Los Angeles Center for Urban Natural Resources Sustainability. So that to me is a pretty hefty sentence in itself. In that, I'll get to the questions further on down, but right off the bat, what is a research social scientist?
So a research social scientist is a researcher who uses a scientific method to better understand society's interactions with forests and natural resources. The exception to my job is that, one, I work in cities, and two, I have a really interdisciplinary background in soils, watershed, policy, economics, and forestry. So that gives me a little bit kind of a different lens to look at problems in and around cities. And that's where people are, right? So we cause a lot of problems. We're also the solution to these problems. So that's my job, is to kind of better understand this and kind of package it in a form that folks from state and private forestry, the national forests, and the different cities, communities, local governments can understand to conserve our natural resources and better use them.
And of course, the first thought comes to my mind is you're obviously you're an extrovert. You have to be somebody who likes to talk. And I'm guessing that you do go out and you do polls, or you find ways to get people to answer your questions, to give you that feedback. Yeah?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You know, it's interesting because I told you my background. I started off with the Bureau of Land Management as a firefighter and a resource tech. When I started working for the Forest Service, I was mapping soils and wilderness areas, and I really missed being around people. So that's why I went on to graduate school. So that's exactly what I learned in graduate school. What to do is how to measure people's awareness, attitude, opinions about the environment. So I do surveys, right? I do interviews, but I also use satellite imagery, geographical information systems, statistics, and I still every once in a while go out and measure trees. And I combine all that information to kind of understand what people think, why they interact, what their knowledge is, how can we identify certain problems in this kind of people, society, natural resource nexus. So yeah, social scientists, that's what we do. We study people. The exception is to us is the forest, the natural resources are always present in these problems. And these problems could be pretty broad. They're typical about recreation, forest use, but also changing climates, changing demographics, uh, attitudes about the Forest Service, attitudes about conserving certain species, human wildlife interactions. So that's it. We have a really broad array of problems that we've got to use our skills to kind of better understand. But you're right, it's people centric. That's probably the difference between what I used to do as a soil scientist for the Forest Service and what I do now. Kind of people are my focus as opposed to soils, trees, and the resource.
I wrote down some questions I have to ask you later, just because just the aspect of speaking to people and seeing certain trends as we go through very changing times. But before we get in there, can you explain to the listeners about what the Los Angeles Center for Urban Natural Resource Sustainability is?
So a couple of years ago, the research branch of the Forest Service established these urban field stations. So the focus of these stations wasn't necessarily national forest or natural forest. It was cities, focused on the trees in and around cities. And they set up some of these stations in the northeastern U.S., but then they started establishing some other stations in the West, like in Denver and Los Angeles. The difference with the LA Urban Center is that we're not strictly research and development. We're also really closely tied with state and private forestry. So the LA Urban Center consists of myself from research and development and Yassi Wilkins from Region 5 State and Private Forestry. So we're in the same office. So we work really closely together to kind of bring research, outreach, education, and tech transfer all under one roof. And further, what's really unique about our arrangement is we work really closely with the city of Los Angeles. So we rent space from the city of Los Angeles in downtown LA. I'm physically in the office. Yassi is physically in the office. And not only that, but we work with different partners in the greater LA area, such as CAL FIRE, City Plants, Tree People, Amigo de los Rios, LA County, the city of LA. So a lot of this co-production of research, what we call, right, when researchers interact and identify problems and solve these problems along with our partners, that's what we do. It's really interesting the setup we have. The city of LA rents us this space really cheaply. State and private forestry pays for it. I think the Angeles National Forest pays for our internet, for example. My salary comes from research and development, obviously. Yassi Wilkins' salary comes from state and private forestry. And that's kind of our role, kind of be the hub for people to come together and address these problems we have in and around Los Angeles whenever it comes to issues of urban forests, urban sustainability. And we foster collaborations, we organize meetings, we fund some research fellows, local graduate students to undertake some problems that are group of partners, which we call the executive oversight team, that they identify every year. So they take these problems on. So as you can see, it's a really participatory, cross-disciplinary, public, private, community-based organization, environmental organization setup. So it's really unique. Sometimes it can be really slow and clumsy, but when things come together, I think we do a lot of really neat things, and it's a really unique model.
Yeah, it's it's a very unique little niche that's out there, and again, more questions come up just because Los Angeles in itself, it's a urban forest, so to speak. Right. And we've been actually covering a lot of urban forests lately. A lot of funding's come out, putting the trees into the cities to provide shade, and
that's right.
There's just the even again, it's almost like under perceived of how important they are. Yet when it's hot or you see them, you don't know what. Almost like a chemical reaction happens and it's a positive one. It provides a little bit of like,
That's right.
oh, I like seeing that green tree amongst all the concrete. So
That's right. That's right.
so you mentioned a little bit about your background. How did you get into sort of weave your career path for the listeners of how you actually got to sit in a chair in Los Angeles for the U.S. Forest Service?
Yeah, yeah. So in high school and when I first started as an undergraduate, I realized I really liked the outdoors. I really liked being outside, but I never really realized that you could have a career in this. So I saw an advertisement for a position with the Bureau of Land Management. So I applied for it as an undergraduate, as a work study, right? So I, work a couple of hours during the week. So that got me really interested in natural resources. And in the summers, I was on a fire crew. Then I saw this opportunity to be I think they used to call it the co-op program, and I think it later evolved into a couple of other different names. But it's basically this opportunity where you work for an organization, for the Forest Service in an office one semester. Next semester you're in school, and then when you wrap up your bachelor's degree, they kind of transition you into a permanent position. So as a soils major, I started off mapping soils all over New Mexico and Arizona in national forest and wilderness areas. And then in the summers, I was on a burned area emergency response crew. So it was really interesting at first, but then I started realizing that there was more to solving problems than just mapping soils. So I went and got a master's in watershed management from Arizona. That was great, but then I still also noticed that I really wasn't really helping people. And the more I kind of worked in this, I realized I really enjoyed helping people. I really liked interacting with people. And mapping soils, doing burn rehab and restoration was great, but I really missed that people interaction, really making people's lives better through natural resources. So that's when I went off to my PhD in New York, where I worked with the Northern Research Station part-time, and I got my PhD at State University of New York. And I got it in policy because I really wanted to learn these skills we were talking about. How do you measure the importance of nature? How do you capture people's attitudes, knowledge, opinions about natural resources? And I noticed that that if I was interested in people, I had to be around communities. That's where people are. So that's why I got interested in urban forestry. So when I first started, the last thing I wanted to do was be around cities. I wanted to be out in wilderness areas. But as I evolved as a natural resource professional, I really came to the realization that if I want to help people, I've got to go to where they're at, right? Communities, cities, towns. So that's how I ended up in urban forestry. After my PhD, I went back as a soil scientist in Colorado. I was working as a forest soil scientist on the Arapahoe Roosevelt for 1 or 2 years. An opportunity came up to be a professor in the University of Florida in urban and community forestry, right? What I was always interested in. So I went off, I left the Forest Service and I went off to the University of Florida for about 10 years. And then from there, I was in South America, where I was a professor of socio-ecological systems. So this is kind of a way of looking at problems from both the social science and a biophysical perspective. And I was down there for 5 years. And then this opportunity came up here at the LA Urban Center and at the research station 3 years ago. So I came up. So as you can see, this trajectory, I'd like to think that I've kind of acquired a lot of different skills and worked with a lot of different people and different geographies and different problems. So when I saw this opportunity, I really jumped at it.
Yeah. Wow. That's, you've definitely weaved your way in a lot of places, and it seems to all have a connection to what you do now. And certainly one bolsters the next step that you made in your career, in your life. Quite interesting. So to go back to the point where, if anybody's listening to this and they like playing in dirt, there's a soils major in college?
That's right. Wow. That's right. But hey, soils is the center of everything: water, plants, climate, carbon sequestration. It's soils is the center of it all.
Yeah, I was going to say,
it's great. It's a great resource, but again, we're the ones causing the problem. So it's it's kind of a two-pronged approach, right? Soils, trees, ecosystem, water. it's important, but it's people, right? So that's my focus. But yeah,
No, I got it.
I
It
was a
was
forest soil scientist.
it's a very it's an I mean, it's not much of a stretch to say from dirt to humans. I mean, there's
Hey, no. So dirt is what your mother used to get angry at you for bringing into the house. Soil is different,
soil is
right? Soil
alive.
is,
It's got
exactly all that.
Oh yeah, you mentioned
And in
the
fact, one thing I missed during my trip, I actually mapped soils in Alaska for a while for the Forest Service on the Tongass, and I
but
think that really brought home the message.
that's
It was beautiful, but it's like, wow, I really need to be around people.
and
So
that,
there it is. I went off to New York, Bogota, Santiago, Chile, and now Los Angeles. And I worked in Miami also a lot when I was with the University of Florida.
I think we have another episode just to talk to you about soils.
There you go.
You
Yeah.
mentioned wanting to be back to around people and in the communities. I'm kind of curious to go back to a couple minutes ago as we were talking about you being down in the Los Angeles area. What are well, maybe we shouldn't get into the trends, but I wrote down the differences between and the perspectives between a city like Los Angeles and the mountain towns, the hill towns that are maybe somehow directly connected, next door, adjacent to a national forest.
Right.
That it's got to be quite different. And I'm sure as a social scientist, you're completely aware of that when it comes to the diversity, the ethnic backgrounds, the need for actually to have those natural resources, to have that outdoor connection. Whereas, if you go down in LA, you're like, well, how is this an urban forest? It's pretty much concrete. Well, no, there's trees, obviously. And if you get on a beautiful day, you can actually see the Angeles National Forest. And
yeah, that's right.
It gets millions and millions of visitors.
So it's almost, the other way of looking at it also, when you're in those mountain communities on a clear day, you can see 15 million people, right at the base of all these communities. So I think one of the perspectives that a lot of people with my background have is, you don't look at a city and its urban forest or a community and the surrounding forest. It's all kind of one big system, right? They're all interacted. People commute from these mountain communities to LA. People from LA go to these mountain communities on the weekends. So they're all interconnected. So I think one of our, in this process of trying to be nimble and address all of LA's problems, one of the things we're trying to do is really have a kind of a bigger regional perspective. I think for a while we were very much focused on the city of LA. And I think based on a lot of our partners' needs, we're trying to expand this to kind of the greater LA, right? Quote unquote, which is not just the city of LA County, but the western portions of Riverside, San Bernardino, Orange, and even Ventura. Because these problems aren't confined to city limits, right? Solutions aren't confined to one local government or one agency. So we need kind of this bigger look at these problems. So yeah, I think a lot of these communities have similar things going on, but obviously the way you approach these problems, the way you have to study these problems, and the way you present these solutions to these different folks is different, right? Urbanization and the need to conserve green spaces. I think that's a city of LA problem, and it's a Lake Arrowhead and a Big Bear problem as well. Wildfire, you'd think that it used to be strictly a problem of these mountain communities, but as we've seen in Santa Rosa, Ventura, Paradise, and recently in Hawaii, fires are now coming into not just the edge of the cities, but into the city itself. So that's one real new problem for us. In urban forestry, we used to recommend lots of trees, big trees, leafy trees all around your home for all these heating benefits that you mentioned, property values, air quality. But from a fire perspective, we were pretty much recommending to folks, hey, clear off all the vegetation in and around your home. But as you go to, depending on what hat you put on, the urban forester or the fire manager, you can't have all that vegetation in this part of the world around your home. On the other hand, if you show this home without any greenery, trees, vegetation around it, it doesn't look like a very livable home. So that's a new problem, despite all these experiences I've had in different parts. This issue of what's that middle ground? Well, what vegetation can you have near your home? Where should you have it? Is it really affecting or increasing the risk of your home being lost during a fire if you have a certain amount of vegetation? So that's the new challenge for us. That's a new research project for us that we're trying to undertake. Yeah, and the demographics are also changing. I think for a lot of these mountain communities, you could assume that they were fairly homogenous, upper income, but now we're starting to see that these communities also they're pretty diverse. It's Southern California, culturally, language-wise, income-wise. A lot of these mountain communities are also changing. These fringes, these urban interface, that's also changing. We're also starting to see newer demographic groups moving into these areas. Um, so yeah, that's the interesting and challenging thing about these areas. They're constantly changing, and we're constantly having to adapt our methods and our approach to these new problems.
Yeah, you it sounds like you kind of covered one of my questions, which was some of the research projects you're working on at the Pacific Southwest Research Station. You kind of hinted at, actually, you did speak towards it, but the wildlife urban interface, which I don't know if necessarily this is a common term that the public knows. They might hear it.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
know that we say it WUI, which is
Yeah,
obviously
that's
the
right. That's
abbreviation
right. That's our
acronym for
technical
it.
speak. That's right.
But you did, and obviously it contains the word urban in it. And you mentioned how, again, we're seeing more of those urban interface connections with the homes and the forest. People want to be closer to that nature, and of course,
That's right.
it causes a lot of stress when it comes to wildland fires. You've got a lot more power utility companies. You have a lot
That's right.
more concern when it comes to firefighters going in there because they can't.
That's right.
They have to. One of the priorities is structure and safety of people's lives.
That's right.
And if it's out in the middle of nowhere, then they have a little bit more room to maneuver and sort of try to block it off and contain it. But boy, when it comes to something like you said, Santa Rosa and Maui, you have to get in there.
Yeah, and I think for the Forest Service, and for those of us that work kind of in this, so this urban interface, it's basically that transition between the city and kind of the surrounding rural areas, right? And it's kind of a gray area because it depends. The WUI, this urban interface, the edges of Los Angeles, like we were talking about, can extend all the way to Big Bear, right? So it's just not where the city limits of LA stops and Pasadena starts. No, it's more than that. So we're having to kind of adjust our way of thinking of how we define what these problems are. They're not limited as national forests anymore. They're not limited to landscapes. I mean, they vary from property to property, right? What one homeowner decides to do in terms of the trees, shrubs, vegetation in these high fire risk areas will affect the person next door or the person across the street. So we're not used to that, right? We're used to dealing with landscapes, stands, forests, soil types. But now in this situation, it varies from property to property, and every property has a different homeowner, and every homeowner is unique in the terms of their sociodemographics, but in the way they think about nature and these green vegetation around their homes, right? So it makes our problem a lot more complex, I think, than strictly working with national forests. And going back to people that have my background, that's why we need to really approach these things from different disciplines and different groups, whether they're NGOs, community-based, natural resource, because there isn't one group of folks, one discipline that can address these problems. We have to kind of address them in working close together in collaboration because they're just really complex.
Okay, I mean, we get it. When it comes to the urban forests, we know why. I think I just mentioned why people like to live close to woods, forests. It provides shade. It's that greenery type of, again, a chemical reaction of seeing beautiful nature. So and again, not wanting to be around a concrete jungle, it might, maybe fresher air. There's all kinds of things, and
Yeah.
obviously from a research standpoint, you can go deep into the woods on it. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No
one of
pun
the,
intended.
yeah, right, absolutely. One of the things that you mentioned was defensible space. So,
Yeah.
and I don't know if this has been in a research situation as well, but there was that fire, the Caldor fire, that went up through the El Dorado. It sort of threatened the Camino and the Pollock Pines area, and then it shifted and it went through Kaisberg and towards obviously Lake
Yeah, yeah,
Tahoe.
yeah, yeah.
If you drive up through 50, and if you take a right or left off of 50 into any of those communities, they've got canopies upon canopies of trees, pine trees that are just towering over their homes. I mean, 2 to 3 feet from their walls, and
Yeah,
you can
that's
see
right.
all the pine needles all over the roofs. But
That's
then,
right.
then you see a house that has cleared all that out and removed some of the trees. But the thing I keep on hearing is it costs lots of money to remove a tree. You can have a defensible space all you want, but the person next door to you doesn't do anything.
That's right.
It must be
That's right.
frustrating, I'm sure, when it comes to
Yeah,
trying to
yeah, yeah.
figure out how to manage that defensible space and live in that wildland urban interface.
Last year, for example, I was in Grizzly Flats and we drove around with some folks, with some Cal Fire folks there. And it varies, yeah. One house did everything right. They lost it. One house didn't do so many things in and around their homes, but they lost it. But one thing I think the general understanding way to look at this is like any fuel treatment, right? You treat for the average type of event, right? And there's certain things you can do to minimize your risk. There's other types of events where, talking about fuel breaks, Interstate 5 won't stop, Ember transport, right? But on the average type of conditions, I think there's some very basic practices that you can do and that the homeowner can do. And I think if you educate them on the potential of, losing their home versus doing these basic, simple practices, I think it'd be fairly a convincing statement, right? That you have to do certain things every year. And they're not out of the question. When it comes to trees in cities, we have that same issue. It's dry, it's Los Angeles, we plant a tree, but then people have to water it. So that's, when looking at the other side, that's another issue we've had to figure out how to communicate to people that it doesn't take that much water to keep these trees going. But it's educating them and communicating that importance of doing certain follow-up practices to get these benefits. So yeah, with the Grizzly Flat situation, it's interesting because it's just not the greenscape. A lot of the research, what's showing, it's some of the primary factors in these homes being lost is the construction type, the building type, right? You can do everything around your yard, but if you have the inappropriate roof type, your building construction material, that's probably more important than the actual greenery. So I would suggest that, what we know so far, and obviously we're studying this, is that there is this midpoint where you still can have these benefits from vegetation. And if you build your house right, if you take into account some of these maintenance practices, removing leaves, pruning, irrigating certain species, certain plants that are near your homes, I think you can really reduce that risk of loss, during average conditions.
Yeah, no, by now, there are so many examples of tragic loss, and there's so many
Mm-hmm.
examples of it can happen almost anywhere.
That's right.
So, but just looking at the rebuttal from the homeowners when it comes to the costs of getting a tree removal company to come out. You know, the now in the news, insurance. Insurance is leaving California. People are not paying
That's right.
homeowners
That's right.
insurance. It's definitely stretching uh, the ability of the homeowner to figure out what's best for them. And again, we all have to live with each other. And the other thing too is people come together afterwards. Obviously, as a community that went through a tragic loss, I'm just hoping that there's people that almost use this as a wake up call.
It's interesting, with these research we're doing. We're kind of going back to some of these cities that have experienced these kind of urban fires. Right down the road here in Los Angeles, there's San Bernardino, right? So in 2003, they had the old fire. They had a lot of homes that were lost. So you go back there now, 20 years later, and you're seeing, wow, this is back to where they were in square one. We're obviously not getting the message to them that, hey, there's certain things you have to do. Dry vegetation, the wrong types of, wood piles next to their homes. So yeah, there's a lot of really interesting opportunities to start focusing in on these problems and educating these folks and researching these problems. Because I think a lot of our focus again has been on these kind of outlying mountain communities, the ex-urban group of homes, right, and that gated community on the edge of town. But these neighborhoods are really offering a really unique opportunity, a window in time almost. If you go back to the Oakland Hills, if you go back to San Bernardino, like I said, there's a really opportunity to learn from these experiences and see what worked and what didn't work, and how we can educate folks to kind of hit that fine point, right? That middle point where they can have all the greenscapes, but at the same time reduce the risk of fire hazard.
Yeah, I mean, just for me living in the town that I'm in, I'm keenly aware of people converting their lawns into the rockscapes and having more drought resistant plants because obviously the cost of water. So but there's still that I understand there's still that wind that can take palm fronds and
yeah, that's right.
and
That's
crazy
right.
crazy things miles and miles away, and then next thing you know, you have a spot fire that you completely have no idea about. Eucalyptus trees. There's a ranch behind our house, and they're gigantic eucalyptus trees. It's all pretty crazy. I wanted to go back again to how long have you been in that position there?
I've been here 3 years.
Okay, so the trends. I think you're probably butting up against the pandemic, the coronavirus, and I'm sure that the numbers are pretty interesting to see how they ebb and flow. Certainly, they spiked during the pandemic of people just wanting to get out to some place where they consider themselves safe and get away from looking at the same four walls. But any insight regarding the trends that you might have seen as you go through these years?
Yeah, it's when as I think this was best phrased or worded by one of our partners from the Los Padres National Forest. For the past couple of years, we've been begging the people to get out to the forest, and then during the pandemic, we didn't know what to do with all these folks. And in talking with some of these partners from the National Forest, just 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the San Gabriel National Monument with the partnership coordinator from the Angeles National Forest, and that certain socio-demographic groups are using these areas, right, which they should, and that's a good thing. But there seems to be something missing in the education and the awareness about pack it in and pack it out in terms of trash. They have folks out there, they're doing the follow-up, but there's something missing in the way we communicate with these folks. A lot of these folks are Spanish speakers, So that's kind of one, that's an example of how we through the center we collaborate with some of these partners and trying to help them with their problems. Is that now we're trying to figure out how do we get that message out? Is it through commercials? Is it through school programs? And the main issue we came up with is we need to know this audience a little bit better. So that's kind of our next step. Like we told you, we're funding some research fellows to kind of undertake this problem to try to get to understand a little bit better who these folks are, where do they live, why do they use these areas. That's one example of the demographic change. The other demographic change we're seeing, like I mentioned earlier, is that we're getting new demographic groups moving into these these neighborhoods on the edges of cities. The racial ethnic composition is changing. And with that, we still don't know, are there language issues? Are there different ways people like receiving communication about conservation and environmental awareness? So those are some of the examples of how these changes are really kind of affecting the way we kind of take our research and trying to identify who these folks are and how we can get this information out to them.
Yeah, it is slightly bothersome regarding, we still deal with graffiti and defacing facilities. I don't know if it's anger towards just the federal government or just, hey, I'm 15 years old or something, and this is what I'm doing at this point in my life. I mean, I did.
But then there's other extremes also. Just taking your garbage and packing it out with you.
I know, I get that, and I was mentioning there's also a generational gap. I was speaking to my father-in-law.
That's the other thing, the youth. That's right.
And there was something about, we used to throw our bags of McDonald's out our vehicle, and you're like, what? And you thought that was okay? Well, yeah. And I was like,
yeah, that's right.
And now I know that obviously there's more focus on recycling and clean earth and all those things. So again, maybe it's a generational gap that we're going to eventually get through, and there's going to be more awareness, more let's take care of the planet, more of the woodsy owl, lend a hand, care for the land type of thing, because it's crazy. And then you mentioned getting out there and then having these massive people, flood the forests. I get it too. When you go to a national park, there are millions of people in such a small footprint because they can see a lot of the natural wonders of the world, and they're right there. But it takes very little effort to get to those locations to see it. But a little more effort beyond that, which again, I get most people or a certain amount of people can't do. But one thing when I go hiking, I get crazy happy when I've just hiked 22 miles and I didn't see a single person. So there is a solitude that I think that national forests have over.
But that's an interesting topic, because a lot of the demographics like being around other people when they go out to national forest. They like being in a group of people. They like interacting with other folks. See the complexity of working in these types of areas where there's just a bunch of people with different values, different outlooks.
That's right.
And taking your example, we work with a lot of people who can't go out to these areas. So these urban forests outside of the national forest or the national parks, that's their exposure to green. That's their exposure to nature. So how do we bring nature to their backyard? That's the Inflation Reduction Act, tree plantings, giving decision makers the information they need so they can promote the importance of conserving green spaces in cities. Do you keep a park? Do you keep these group of trees, or do you put a business in there, right? What are the advantages and costs of each? That's our job is, we need to grow. Yes, people need places to live, but they also need nature. They also need environment. I think we've got a lot of information out there that shows why it's important.
Well, Francisco, it sounds like a very, almost every time you do something, you probably still get amazed. You're still surprised by human nature, both in a good way and a bad way. And there seems to be nothing that you could dive into and study because it's constantly changing and it's quite fascinating. So I thank you so much for sharing your story and letting us know a little bit about what you do. And appreciate it. I look forward to speaking to you in the future.
Yeah, you bet. Nice talking to you.
Before we bring on our next guest, did you know that the Northern Research Station is located in Madison, Wisconsin, and covers Maine to Minnesota and Missouri to Maryland, 20 states? To the north of us is the Pacific Northwest Research Station located in Portland, Oregon, and covers Alaska, Oregon, and Washington. All right, so let's get back to our employee spotlight. All right, well, now we are joined by Sylvia Chi. She is also from the research station. And this is actually interesting because my understanding is you're moved from your Davis facility to the Vallejo regional office, which is interesting because we're going to be sort of talking about buildings and facilities. So without releasing it to the listening audience, could you first tell us about your background? For instance, I know that you're in the engineering realm. So yeah, tell us a little about that and how you sort of got into that career path and weave it from sort of how you grew up.
Well, thank you for having me on. I am a civil engineer who has pretty much worked in the Forest Service my entire career. I was born and raised in the SF Bay area, and my parents actually immigrated from China, so I'm a first-generation college student. From there, during my time at UC Berkeley, I had an opportunity to intern at the Olympic National Forest in Washington, and after I graduated, I pretty much converted full-time to be the assistant facilities engineer over on the Gifford Pinchot. And from there, I went on to become the facilities engineer at the National Forest in Lassen, so the Lassen National Forest, before landing where I'm now, which is the assistant station engineer of the Pacific Southwest Research Station.
Okay, so it seems like whenever I talk to people, they're always, it's amazing how they bounce around so much. And so you were raised in San Francisco Bay Area, but then you went to college at UC Berkeley. By the way, what did you go to college for? What was your focus?
It was also civil engineering. So
okay, so you were locked into that particular career path from the start.
Yeah.
All right, wonderful. And then you found a job fair through the.
Yes.
Okay.
So they had a career fair on campus. I dropped in, walked around, and the National Forest Service pretty much caught my eye. I was like, okay, I'm looking for summer interns just to get some work experience. At that time, I've only just been a full-time student, so I was looking for some work experience too, especially in the field of civil engineering, and it caught my interest. So I went and applied. I got the position as an intern. I actually worked 2 summers on the Olympic National Forest, had a great time, and after I graduated, as part of the program, they would convert me onto a full-time position, and I got converted at the Gifford Pinchot National Forest.
Where's the Gifford Pinchot National?
So the Gifford National Forest is also in the state of Washington. It is you would most iconically it's known for Mount St. Helens.
Okay.
So,
but then ultimately you had to move.
Yes, I had to move. Okay. It was really interesting because that was my SCEP student that was first really me leaving home for entire summer for the first time.
Right.
When I started out as a SCEP student. And then right after I graduated, it was I moved out of the state pretty much. So part of where, if you follow my trajectory of how I moved, I was moving closer back to home. So for the Gifford Pinchot, I worked for, when I jumped to the Lassen, that put me at the very northern parts of California. So it was about, I guess, an hour and a half from Reno, right in that northeast corner of California. And then my current position, which is the assistant station engineer for Pacific Southwest Research Station, my office was Davis until we had our office moved just recently. We moved out of that building at the end of October. My new duty location is Vallejo.
That's
So I
that's a
pretty
full
much
circle.
moved back to the Bay
That's a
Area.
full circle right
Yes,
there.
I
I
did a
mean,
tour.
it's more of a rubber band effect, but yeah, I get it.
Yes.
Okay, and you mentioned SCEP. Can you let us know what does that mean?
Okay, so SCEP is a Student Career Experience Program.
Okay,
That
and do
was
they
the
do they have
program.
those still today?
I don't believe they have that program specifically. What they have right now is the Pathways program.
Ah, yes, that's the one we've heard about
Yes.
quite a lot.
Yes. So
Okay.
that is where
Similar vein.
it is. It is. It's pretty much, I think the SCEP pretty much became the Pathways program in a sense.
All right. Well, I mean, you actually went to college for something, and you actually got a career in that major. That's quite impressive. Okay, we've heard a lot about the research side of the research station, but could you give us a little overview regarding facilities and engineering? Because, I'm thinking, there's people in this is in my vision, people in lab coats, and you're doing all kinds of interesting things in there, but you always forget that there's somebody taking care of the building and somebody taking care of all the, the structural designs and architecture and landscaping. So this is quite interesting because it's a fully contained facility, and you're part of the facilities and engineering department, correct?
Yes. Yes. So pretty much facilities and engineering, we support the operations side of research. And like you said, it's keeping the buildings running, making sure the plumbing's good, HVAC is running. You have your maintenance and repairs for anything that's falling apart. Generally, landscaping is also covered, so we try to keep all our sites fairly well groomed. And we also take care of fleet. So we also have vehicles.
Earlier you mentioned how there's, I guess, just a need of personnel, certainly throughout the season. I was interested, you might want to talk about the seasonality of work. You look at certain things that could be done when there's no snow on the ground and when there is snow. And trust me, yeah, we've actually had quite a few podcasts about research station employees going out and doing some really interesting stuff. So what does your staff look like?
Staff-wise, so engineering team really, we have a station engineer, you have the assistant station engineer. We actually got a facilities planner this year. We have a facility operations specialist, so they're pretty much what I consider zone managers for the facilities in the different zones. We currently have 3, one for Northern California, one for Southern California, and one for Hawaii, because we also have 2 sites in Hawaii that right now. We also have some facility maintenance workers. Currently on staff, I have 3. Actually, all of them have been recent hires. They were actually just hired within the past 2 months. And then we have some admin support. We have our a budget analyst, and I believe we're hiring another, or we're going to be onboarding another support services for some of our admin work, which is really important because we cover a lot. I believe we have 13 major sites, and then we have a couple of workstations too. So
I was about to ask that. You don't just do facilities and engineering for that, for that building that you used to work in, Davis.
No, we have everything from Northern California to Southern. So like on our farthest north side, we have Arcata. There is Redding, Bogard. There is Fort Bragg, and then as you're going south, it's like there's Placerville. We recently got out of Davis, so like pretty much we're centralizing over into Vallejo. We're also getting out of our Albany office, which is also centralizing into Vallejo. We have an office down for the San Joaquin Experimental Range. We have Dinky Creek, Dinky Mills, our 2 work centers along the Sierra, around closer to like I guess central southern.
And these are
California.
just buildings like that.
These are sites. They're not buildings. These are actually full-on sites where there's some of the sites actually do have multiple buildings. You have some of them have the larger lab facility. So Arcata is just one building, or actually no, it's 2 because you include the pump house. My bad. But like it's a pretty big lab facility there. If you go down to the riverside, it's a full site where you have multiple buildings. There's storage sheds. There's, I think, 3 major admin buildings. There's a fire lab, which is a separate building. There's like, so I think altogether we have over, I would say at least over 100 buildings that are in the facilities inventory.
So there's a lot of unique buildings when you look at these facilities on these sites, and I can only assume that when you look at them on a map, and again I mentioned that thing seasonality. When you go down to these locations, some of them got to be different, right? Some of them are up in the mountains. Some of them get snow loads on them.
Yes.
Some of them just get massive.
So some of our buildings do get what we call winterized, where they close down for the winter because there's too much snow, and you can't really access those buildings when snow is down, when you get 3-4 feet of snow, possibly more actually in some areas. So we winterize buildings where we shut it down, drain out all the water, make sure that way the pipes don't freeze. So we do have a couple of sites that have that, and then you have the sites that are open year round, like Hawaii. That's year round.
Yeah, that's again, that's interesting when you look at because you said architectural and design of just looking at the buildings, because right when you go out and you look at a Forest Service facility, I think the primary goal is to make them one with nature. You know, they have a lot of rock, a lot of wood, and they blend in a little bit with the natural background. Again, snow loads, the angle of the roofs, but they also get storm damage. The roads get washed out. There's floods. Again, 300% snowpack this past year. Obviously, fires probably damage. Besides just seeing the Forest Service out there with a career opportunity, did you ever think that you'd be working for the Forest Service as a civil engineer?
It really wasn't when I first went into civil engineering, that was not something that I thought I would be doing. And then it was like after, coming across it, doing an internship, I was like, oh, this is a career. This is something that I can, I enjoy. I like the agency mission as a whole, which is, we're basically land management, for future generations. We're trying to manage our current natural resources the best we can for the greatest good.
But you could have worked, high-rise buildings or the San Francisco Business District and things like that. But so for you to...
for me, I like the outdoors. I will admit, it was a very different experience in terms of just when I did my internship, being out in the woods. I did some surveying out, and it was, I liked being out in the woods and not, I grew up in the city. So for me, being out in the woods was a treat. It was something that I really enjoyed, instead of having to be stuck in a room, staring at a cubicle, stuck in a cubicle, staring at your computer. I have that because regardless, we're always going to have paperwork, but it gave the opportunity to at least get out there and touch grass like these, go out there, smell the roses, or actually I would say smell the fir and cedar, because trees, it's the forest, and it was a very, I think it was something new for me growing from the Bay Area. It was just not something I really had much opportunity until I really got to the Forest Service, and I was like, oh, I get to be outdoors, I get to see all these things. I have to say, for all the different places I've worked at, I've been pretty close, I guess, seeing the mountains, and that's been a joy. Just the snow-capped mountains, that perfect views.
Yeah, you have some pretty good bucket list national forests in your career path. So
yes.
as a civil engineer, Sylvia, can you share with us what maybe one of your most interesting projects that you've done since becoming part of the Forest Research and Development team?
I would say the most interesting project that we've had so far is actually at for our site in Placerville, which is actually a historic site. So the buildings there were built in the 1930s, 1928, 1930s, pretty much. So they're very old buildings. And one from over wear and tear, given that they've been there for pretty much almost 100 years, the chimney and roof had suffered water damage. There is definitely a need to repair that, just to make sure the building doesn't suffer more damage and to keep the building insulated.
And it had a chimney.
A chimney. So yes, it was an old chimney.
I was going to say, because most of them we don't have chimneys in most buildings, do we?
No, it was really interesting because when they first that chimney.
That's how they came back.
At one point, I think they actually used that to. Yeah, how it came back then. I believe at one point it might have actually been used to vent laboratory fume hood, because that was the excess, to get to vacuum things out of the building. It was a vent. So yeah, I believe they actually at one time that room was used as a lab space, and then they converted it to a break room. And then when they sealed that chimney up, they sealed it up with a walk. I believe it was a pallet cast iron walk that they put upside down to cover the vent, and they cemented it in.
Are you saying walk as in WOK?
Yes.
Really?
It was a cooking walk.
Huh.
Yes.
Okay.
There's definitely some interesting things you come across in facilities. And there's definitely some repairs on that. We're just going to do this, figure out how to, I guess it would be like MacGyvering it to some degree. So.
And this was a facility that was being used at the time, or was it abandoned, or?
So no, it was being used, except they just repurposed. So instead of needing that to be lab space, they changed it into a break room, which they didn't need the chimney for anymore. So they sealed up the chimney by putting a walk over the vent hole, and I think they cemented it in, and that was what they did. I don't know when it happened, but we found the walk. So one of the things we had to do was we had to remove that. We found out the mortar had fallen apart, so we had to retouch all that. We put in a water barrier vapor barrier around in the chimney, so that it would prevent more moisture from coming in. We put they actually did a seal coat over on top too, so that it would be more water resistant.
Are you running into lead and asbestos and things like that from the old days?
Yes. I was just about to get into it. So when we did the roof, so that was the chimney, and then the roof itself, we had some roof damage, so we actually re-roofed a portion of the roof. And when they did that, we found out we had asbestos insulation in our roof. So we had to do pretty much stop the project because we found asbestos. We had to get that tested, see how much it was, because it was friable asbestos. So we basically had to have that removed. Got a contractor separately. They came in with the hazmat suits. They made sure to seal the entries into the attic up so that those were airtight, had a vacuum running so that, the asbestos insulation wouldn't be flying everywhere. And we had to get that removed, which was a contract modification. So once that was removed, they could finally finish the rest of the re-roofing work and repairing the water damaged areas, because the roof had been in disrepair for a while. And
now, is this your staff doing this, or are you working with anyone else?
So this was all contracting. So we were working. This actually was because it was such a large project. With our limited staffing levels, we actually went and got an interagency agreement with the U.S. Army Corps, and had them step in to help with doing some of the contract administration and finding contractors to do this large project. Because not only were we doing this project, we also you brought in the whole asbestos and lead. Well, we also were doing a lead remediation project for another one of the buildings on the site, where they pretty much removed the peeling lead paint from the side of the building. They actually had to replace some of the siding because some of the siding had rotted. So there was that project that was also done concurrently.
How long was this project? It sounds like it's months.
Yes, it was definitely months. It also probably didn't help that it was awarded right late fall, like right around like fall-ish. So we ended up dropping into winter, and during the winter we had to put a pause on that project, make sure everything was sealed up, because you can't really work on a roof during the winter when there's rain and snow.
That's right.
Yeah, and then on top of it, like for the painting side, it was after they removed the paint. When you're putting down new paint, they had to have the right weather for the paint to dry. So there was also a time delay there. But
so from obviously you came from, again, you kind of had an idea what you wanted to do when you went to college. You grabbed a hold of certainly a career opportunity, and it turned out quite well for you. If you had any advice to offer the up-and-coming engineering students about working for the Forest Service, what would it be?
It would be prepared to drink from a fire hydrant. Like, there will be a lot of information, a lot of things coming at you, and take in what you can, ask questions, always ask questions, but
when you
do what you can.
Yeah, when you do you work on roads or dams or bridges or anything like that?
So for the Pacific Southwest Research Station, we don't have any bridges. Roads wise, we actually we work with the Forest Service side on the National Forest Service system for the roads side, because we don't have roads.
Okay.
As part of our inventory. But for the Forest Service side, yes, dams, roads, bridges, there is a lot of parts there, because that's coming from my Forest Service experience. Like when I first started, I was very fortunate to be able to actually work in the different areas. I was assisting the bridge engineer. I helped with the transportation. Actually, that was just recently. I actually did a detail with the Region 6 transportation engineering team, and I did a bit of transportation work. Dams, I think on the Lassen National Forest, I had a couple of dam surveys that needed to be conducted that I did there. So definitely, I would say just Forest Service as a whole has a lot of variety.
Is that when you look back at your career, knowing that you're seeing some of the interesting things, and obviously you're doing stuff in Placerville, you've done dam surveys in the Lassen. What has been some of your favorite things about working for Pacific Southwest region and the research station and just Forest Service in general?
I mean, for the Pacific Southwest Research Station, I think for me, it was very interesting just to really get to see R&D. Like Forest Service it's really heavily like specific land management, because they have a plot of, their forests, they take care of, they manage. With R&D, it's, it's pretty spread out. Like for Pacific Southwest, we cover pretty much, we have sites all across California and Hawaii. There's different research going on, different, like, when you go to Hawaii, the Pacific Island, I think Institute of Forestry, the research that they do is very specific to the Pacific Island area. And then you go into to California, it's our Southern California side. I believe we have a fire lab down there that they do fire research. I know for Placerville, they focus a lot on genetics. So they've been developing like trees that are more fire resistant, more that will grow, I guess, well, and don't.
I guess more
pretty much, because then like some of the trees that are grown, it's to like you're mentioning the wildflowers. the trees get replanted out in those areas, and they work on trying to make sure the trees will grow well in those climates, that they will pretty much be resistant to fire.
Yeah.
I think they're trying to be more resistant to like other diseases and stuff. So
you kind of have like you dabble in a lot of different things, and obviously you see certain things coming from the research station itself. And you mentioned you just did a detail, so it sounds like these these opportunities that you're afforded are just giving you that much more enjoyment in your career.
Yes, it does. Like, I mean, I think one of the things is I'm not stuck to the same thing over and over again. So it's not repetitive. There's a lot of variety out there. I mean, going back into the whole details are where you can take a different position within the agency, and pretty much it would usually they're about 4 months. Sometimes they can go up to a year, and you're basically doing a different position from your regular job, and it could be anything almost. Like, you want to make sure you have the skills for it, but it does give you the variety. Like I said, my detail was to transportation. I spent most of my career in facilities, so for me it was something new. It was something different to where I got a chance to learn.
A lot of opportunities.
It is. I mean, for sure.
Okay, it's like it's like the tree of careers.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Sylvia Chi, Silva Engineer. Thank you so much for spending some time and letting us know again another career opportunity, career path that people might not have known about. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Paul.
So far, a social scientist and a civil engineer. Who will be our third and final guest? Stay tuned. Before we reveal that information, here is a little more on our Forest Service research stations. Our Rocky Mountain Research Station is located in, you guessed it, Fort Collins, Colorado, and covers a 12-state area touching from the Canadian border to the Mexico border, the Great Plains, and into Nevada. And finally, our Southern Research Station, located in Asheville, North Carolina, and extends through 13 southern states from the Atlantic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. And now, let's get back into it and dig into some history with our next guest. All right, up next, we have Martin Ritchie, who has been in the Forest Service for 35 years. He is a research forester out of the Redding Research Station. Martin, thank you for joining us. Let's get started with, the fact that you have some history behind you. Can you tell the listeners how the Pacific Southwest Research Station got started?
Sure. First, you have to understand that the Forest Service was formed in 1905, and under the leadership of, at that point in time, Gifford Pinchot. And for the first couple of decades almost, there was no research station anywhere. They didn't exist. I think the very first one that I know of was the Appalachian Station in North Carolina, and that was in 1923. And in that interim period from 1905 to 1923, research was being done, but it was being done under the auspices or leadership of what was then called the district foresters. Back then, we didn't have regions. They were called districts. So this is District 5 back in 1905. And so the research programs were run right out of the district forester's office. But within a few years, they began discussing the possibility of having a separate branch of the Forest Service just for research. And it took a long time. And then, of course, World War I came along, and that interrupted a whole lot of things within the Forest Service. And so it wasn't until after the end of World War I that they began to get really serious about planning for this and phasing in the various research stations. And PSW, what was then called the California Forest Experiment Station, was one of the last ones, maybe the last one, to be created, and that was in 1926. And it was initially a lot of the research being done. We may get into this a little bit more. Was mostly forestry research on specifically growth and yield, some silviculture, and some ecology work, and that was about it back then. They added range. And changed the name to the California Forest and Range Experiment Station within a couple of years, like by 1928 or something like that.
Okay, so the first two were the Appalachian Forest Experiment Station in Asheville and another in New Orleans. What about something about the Pacific Northwest Forest Experiment Station out of Portland? When did they come along? And then like who's and the what's and the where's and the when's of why this thing was founded, these research stations or experiment stations for that matter.
So the Pacific Northwest Experiment Station was founded in 1924, and I think the first station director up there might have been Thornton Munger, and he'd been Thornton Munger goes way back. He came to the Forest Service in about 1907 or so, and he'd been doing research in the Oregon, Washington area, going way back, and so he was instrumental in getting that going up there, that effort. And down here in California, the first station director was a gentleman named Ed Kotok. And Kotok had been here since about, with the Forest Service since about 1911. And his first duty station was a little town of Sisson, which is no longer known by that. It's now known as Mount Shasta. And he was partnered with a guy who'd been there since 1910. So he was the senior partner, a guy named S.B. Shao. And so they were partnered up there in Mount Shasta or Sisson, starting in 1911. And back then, if you read S.B. Shao's writings about this, it was like the Wild Wild West. It was a town with only a few hundred people, but like 20 bars and a couple of brothels and a Chinese laundry, and it was just a kind of a strange existence for those guys. It was really out in the sticks, and so they began doing some research on some growth and yield research, intermixed with some ANFS work as well, and so those two gentlemen became two of the primary researchers in the region or in the district back in that era between, say, 1911 and 1926. And then when the station was formed, Shao was initially supposed to be the first station director, but just about the time they were going to pull the trigger on that move, the regional or district forester job became available, and it was decided that Shao would be a better fit for that. And so he became the regional forester, and Kotok became the station director. And at that point in time, the station was co-located in San Francisco with the regional office. And these two guys worked really closely together. They were not only his colleagues, they were relatives. Kotok married Shao's sister, so they were thick as thieves, those two guys. And so there was a very close relationship during those early years of the station between the region and the station, and driven a lot by the fact that these two gentlemen were very close to one another.
It's interesting because obviously we're speaking about the Pacific Southwest Research Station and its employees, and the fact that you're a research forester. I think we should have put a slash after forester and then historian. It sounds like you've really gotten into the background of how it was created, and which is amazing. I'm sure there books. You mentioned writings. Are there books from both these gentlemen? And I'm going to throw this out there. Were they the first regional forester and research station director?
So there were regional foresters going all the way back to 1905, right? One of the early ones was a gentleman named Courtois, and he came out of the Biltmore School. His is a fascinating story, and yes, he did write a little book about his background in the Forest Service. Most of what I've learned about Shao and Kotok come from there was an effort in the 60s to do an oral history start compiling an oral history of many early Forest Service employees, and both of those gentlemen, if I'm remembering correctly, contributed to that. So they were interviewed, and those interviews, transcripts of those interviews, are now held by the UC Berkeley Library, so anyone can access them. So I've read those. Also, Shao wrote a little memorandum of his early memories of his work with the Forest Service, and I've read that. And also, there are a couple of books written on the history of the Forest Service. I'm drawing a blank, and since I'm not in my office right now, I can't just go pull it off the shelf. But yeah, so I've read that as well. Also spent some time in the National Archives, reading some of the correspondence between some of these folks, because that's all housed there in Maryland.
Well, you mentioned Shasta, which was, I'm kind of curious why that particular spot was chosen, especially if you consider the seedy neighborhood around the area. But and then the station eventually moved, correct? And then was Shao and Kotok, how long were they around?
Okay, so let me clarify maybe a little bit. So Shao and Kotok worked, as I say, at this backwater in Sisson for quite a few years for the region, basically, right? So they were regional employees, foresters. Kotok came out of Michigan. Shao came from Yale, and those were two of the really few forestry schools in operation back then in the early decades of the 20th century. And so a lot of their early work was in that area around Mount Shasta, Weed, over towards McLeod Flats. In fact, we still have one of the ongoing projects I think it's the longest ongoing project certainly in Region 5. It's called the Shao Plantation. It was put in I think somewhere around 1915, and my colleague Jean Weisang is still monitoring that plantation. So it's over 100 years old. So that work was all being done before the station was created, and then when the station was created, and with Kotok in charge, then he was able to sort of cull from the region or the district, some of the best employees who had some sort of a research leaning and some research background to sort of build his early staff. And so I'm hoping this is getting to answer your question. So his early staff included A.E. Wieslander, Duncan Dunning, who were both out of couple of the early graduates of the forestry school at Berkeley. Dunning came out of there about 1915, I think. Victor Clements came to the station somewhere thereabouts. Dunning was kind of an ecologist, silviculturist. Wieslander was sort of an ecologist, I guess, and he spent a lot of his time, most of his career actually, traveling around California and documenting the different forest types throughout California. He has an extensive body of work in not so much in publications, but he photographed everything, and all the photographs are housed at the University of California, Berkeley Library, and those are, I think they're all online actually now. So that was a lot of his emphasis. And then what Dunning did, Dunning sort of carried on some early work by Shao, which was growth and yield work that he and Shao had worked on together and started back in the late teens, like 1919, 1920. So a lot of Dunning's early work was on that growth, those growth and yield projects, and also on some site quality work and things like that. So that was a little bit of the early station personnel.
Some of the stuff that you're mentioning is really fascinating in regards to who was certainly a not necessarily, I guess a subject matter expert, or certainly very interested in a particular niche of research. Any more personnel or research projects that were undertaken, back in the 20s, 30s, 40s?
Yeah, so one of the really interesting chapters in the early research done with PSW, the station moved across the bay to Berkeley pretty early on, I think within about 5 years after being formed in 1926. And so then they were co-located or co-housed with the forestry school there at Berkeley. And at that point in time, in the late 20s, early 30s, there was a gentleman named, I think his first name was Howard, his last name was Siggins, with the station. I don't know much about his background, where he came from, but he did some really interesting work on seed dispersal. And a lot of what we learned about seed dispersal, which was really important back then, because when we think about forest regeneration, we weren't doing much artificial regeneration back in those days. We were relying heavily on natural regeneration, which means you have to understand the seed dispersal, how far seed will go under different conditions, wind and so on. And so he did a lot of his work for different species, figuring out how far different species would disperse by dropping seeds off the Campanile Tower there at Berkeley. And then he published that work, and that's about all that he did. He didn't stay with the station for very long. He died fairly young, but that was his legacy. And so that was kind of interesting work and fairly influential. And then another gentleman that came along was Austin Hassel. He started in about 1931 or 32. And Austin brought an interesting suite of skills. He was probably quantitatively the most gifted guy we had in the station, and he when the Blacks Mountain Experimental Forest was created in 1934, he was brought into that project with Duncan Dunning to set up that whole experimental forest, and they were trying to get it under regulation. And so the first thing they needed to figure out is, well, what was out there? And you have to understand, this was also very early in the field of statistics. Statistics was a very young field back then. And so we didn't really understand how best to quantify that. So the best way he could figure it out was to do a complete census. And so Austin Hassel completely censused every tree over 3.5 inches in diameter on 10,000 acres, which is a monumental task. Measured every tree, and gave a rough location of where those trees were. And so that was really influential, because he published extensively on that. On that, he was able to actually basically simulate different kinds of sampling schemes because of the way he the way he collected the data. It was very well thought out. And incidentally, I have since digitized all that data, and we're in the process right now of making that available on the Forest Service archive. So eventually that whole data set, and it's substantial, about 500,000 tree records, will be available. So that was a really interesting early project. And then Duncan Dunning, and again, working with Hassel, started methods of cutting, an extensive long-term methods of cutting project at Blacks Mountain Experimental Forest, and that started in 1934, 35, 36, around in there. And then the other interesting thing that happened about that same time is we began collaborating pretty closely with the entomology folks at I think it was called the Bureau of Quarantine and Entomology, I think, with the USDA. And there was a group of entomologists with that outfit, and they were also located there in Berkeley. And they began doing a lot of work there in the 1930s in that area at Blacks Mountain and in the surrounding area there in northeastern California on studying bark beetles and different ways of remediation, treatments for what kind of things we can do to address bark beetle problems. And so there was a long and fruitful collaboration with the station for probably through the 30s, 40s, maybe even into the 50s, I think, with the Bureau of Plant Quarantine and Entomology. And so and there was a lot of research that came out of that. A lot of what we know about, or what we learned about risk rating systems came out of that work, trying to look at stands and or individual trees even and say, okay, which trees are at the greatest risk of succumbing to a bark beetle attack, as opposed to which ones are most likely to be able to resist that kind of thing. Which is really helpful when you're thinking about how you're going to treat a stand, which trees to leave and which trees to remove. So that was some of the really important early work that I could add to our previous discussion.
Yeah, no, this is fascinating stuff just because, just the topic you just spoke about, bark beetle and tree mortality, the fact that it was being discussed in the 1930s and it's still being discussed today.
Sure.
So it's quite groundbreaking, I'm sure. And speaking of groundbreaking, I wanted to mention earlier, it sounds like a few areas in Region 5 in the forests are named after some of these pioneers. So that's kind of a nice way to honor the work that they did. So let me ask you this, though. If they moved from Shasta, which, if anybody knows anything about that Shasta area, it sounds like you're surrounded by forests. You can walk out your back door and go do research. Whereas in Berkeley, there's not forest. Yeah. So my question for you, and obviously if it's still similar today, but well, actually, I know it's not similar today because we've done quite a few feature stories showcasing how researchers go out and get research material. Was it, because again, this is the 1920s, 1930s, in Berkeley, are they still traveling out into the forest and getting the stuff they need, or are people bringing material for them to test and do research on?
There was tension. This is where Berkeley was where we had a growing and very capable group of folks in the forestry department there, and then they had a good collaborative relationship with the research station back then. So there was a good synergy there, and so that's why I guess it made sense to have the station located there. But you're absolutely right that there aren't any forests nearby really to work on, to speak of anyway, and so, well, how do we address that problem? And so one of the ways they did that is they began making these little branches, like the Stanislaus branch and the Blacks Mountain branch, where they created basically little remote satellite offices. And in order to address that problem of being able to have the researchers closer to the field where they needed to do their work. And so, eventually then that leads, many years later to the Redding Lab being formed in 1962, Arcata Lab somewhere along there in the 60s or late 50s. I'm not sure when the Arcata Lab was created. And there's been a lot of iterations, really. We had an office in Susanville for a while, and that closed down. So
clearly, there's enough satellite locations that popped up to assist with that research. Because again, you're probably pulling different species from different regions and climates and elevations and so on and so forth.
Right.
So,
but then I'll also mention that somebody like A.E. Wieslander, to the best of my knowledge, he spent his whole career there in Berkeley, and he just traveled a lot. He drove all over the state of California, year after year.
Remind us again. Is that the one that went from tree to tree to tree to tree to tree and collecting all this information?
No. A.E. Wieslander was a lot of his time was spent cataloging the different forest types, cataloging and documenting the different forest types, and California has a wealth of different kinds of forest types. It's really a rich place if you're thinking about different types of forests to study. You have everything from some of the most productive forests on Earth on the North Coast, the redwood Douglas fir forests, and then you transition down to some very, very low productive forests like the pinyon juniper forest that we have. And so there's a tremendous diversity in that respect within the state of California, within the region. And so he had to cover a lot of ground. A guy like Wieslander had to cover a lot of ground. There's just no way, there's no one place for him to go and do his work. He had to cover everything.
And speaking of that, right, again, I keep on going back to, hold on a second, this is the 1920s, 1930s. Like you mentioned, it's the after action of World War I.
Yes.
But at the same time, that volatile time of the market crash, the Great Depression, if you will.
Yeah.
And then there was that kind of a strange sort of, where are we going from here, build up to that sort of bumps into, well, we got forced into World War II.
Yeah.
So an interesting time, again, looking at vehicles, access roads, all these things to be able to move about the state. It's quite fascinating.
So that's certainly a critical issue. The roads, you just think about the road system, the road network of roads that we have in California right now, nothing like what they had back then, right? They had a lot of the roads were either non-existent or they weren't paved, and it took forever to get places. And they had oftentimes had to walk long distances to get to things they really wanted to see. So, and really, when you go back to some of the really early work done in the teens and the 20s, a lot of that was done on horseback.
Oh, yeah, right. That's right. Well, I mean, if you look at the interstate highway system, well, let's just move that off to the side. And the fact that you have forest roads, I could just, you're thinking of a lot of definitely use of the pack stock.
Yeah.
Can you, was any of this research focused on fire? Because, again, looking at what's happening today or in within the last decade here in California, what about back then? Was it a focus of the researchers?
Yes, there was some early work done on fire. In fact, one of the earliest paper that had some great impact was the work of Shaun Kotok, published on fire in California, and that was work done in the early 20s, I think, is about when that came out. I don't remember the exact date, but very impactful. It seems when we go back and read their work today, it seems a little dated. When it is dated, because they were very much focused on productivity, and of course, fire is an enemy of productivity. It reduces productivity in general, and so there is sort of built into their work, while it was quality work, there's a kind of a bias against fire. Fire is universally bad. One kind of gets that impression when you read the work of Shaun Kotok on fire in California. And certainly over the years we've learned a lot more about that, and we have a little more nuanced view on that now. But yeah, so yes, there we recognized early on that fire was was important, but primarily the early work was on its role on affecting productivity and what can we do to avoid that problem. How do we put out fires and how important it is to keep fires out of the forest, which of course led to some later problems that we're now still to this day dealing with.
All right, so if I'm doing my okay, hold on a minute. I have to get my calculator here. Okay. The research station has been around nearly 100 years. How has its mission and the work being conducted changed during that time frame?
Well, there's a couple things that come to mind. Perhaps the most notable one is that our research focus has broadened considerably. Early on, focus, as I mentioned earlier, was on silviculture, growth and yield. Maybe we got into some early nursery practices, things like that. You look at what we do now; it's much broader. My goodness, we've gotten into things like forest meteorology and of course wildlife and hydrology, and none of that was really a focus, really, in the very early years of the station. And then, of course, the other thing more broadly is we now have a presence in Hawaii and the Pacific Islands, and so that was really not a part of the early work either. So I would say those are the two big changes that when you contrast the early years of the Pacific Southwest Research Station or California Forest Range Experiment Station, and back then, but versus now.
It's amazing the extent of what's been added, based off of our continuing field knowledge, lessons learned, technology. It's pretty amazing. I would think that all the pioneers would probably be clapping right now, saying, "Yes, we love this. Keep going." Now, with the idea that there are other Forest Service research stations, what would you say that makes the Pacific Southwest Research Station unique? You mentioned a little bit about how the forests in the areas in California are just unto themselves very unique.
Well, the contrast between the different stations, and this is kind of complex because one of the things that has happened over the decades is that we've shrunk from many smaller research stations to fewer and larger ones, right? And so in that process, the answer to that question kind of depends on which decade you're looking at, because we've reshaped and kind of rejiggered everything over time. But one of the big differences is that we have different forest types, across say in the south, you've got a lot of that coastal plain area, a lot of loblolly pine, slash pine, all that kind of stuff. Very different forest types than what we've got here in California, and so on, across the whole country. So that's one big difference. Certainly there are things that overlap, but the fact that we do have different forest types, and then there can be different issues, maybe political issues or things like that. In California, fire is important really throughout the West, but really it's California's ground zero for forest fire in North America. So it's a real important focus here, because it's just we deal with it at such a catastrophic level when it happens oftentimes. And of course, it's a Mediterranean environment here, so that contributes heavily to the dynamic with fire. So that's a big part of it. Each station was allowed to kind of create their research portfolio as that region and those forest types demanded, and as the economic demands in that particular region presented themselves. So that's, I think, the breakdown into different regional experiment stations has been good in that respect. And then the other thing is that they're guided to a certain extent by the people. Every time we have a new station director, the focus on what we're doing shifts just a little bit. And so, that evolves over time as well, just because of personnel. And then, there's also the demands. What are the key things driving concerns at a given point in time? Those are dynamic and they change over time. Right? So,
yeah, the closest research station out of the region is the Pacific Northwest.
Well, yeah. So, yeah, and they're headquartered in Portland and I think they've always been. They've never moved, to the best of my knowledge, out of the Portland headquarters.
And is there a collaboration? And eventually, I would like you to talk a little bit about partnerships and within the state, because obviously there's no border lines. I mean, obviously there's borders, but for the most part, trees and beetles and fire and things like that don't stick to those things. So I'm assuming there's got to be a partnership with the state as well.
Sure, we do have. It's common to have research partnerships, both within the state of California with other agencies, with industry. There's a long tradition of collaboration with, for example, CAL FIRE. We have the work that we've been doing for many years in hydrology down in Jackson State Forest, and so that predates by many years my coming to the station in the 80s. So sure, the answer to that is yes. We do collaborate, and we also collaborate cross station. That's very common. I'd say probably more common now than it would have been back in the olden days, back in the 30s and 40s. But
you mentioned the Jackson State Forest. Is that the Jackson Demonstration State Forest?
Yes, Jackson Demonstration State Forest. It's operated by CAL FIRE.
Okay, let me ask that question because I've seen this in a few of our stories. I keep on seeing demonstration or experimental forests. Is there a difference? What does demonstration actually mean?
Okay, so when we're doing activities in a forest, our focus is often on research. So we're trying to conduct research. Sometimes that might be observational research. It might be a replicated designed experiment. And oftentimes this leads to publications. We hope, that's one of our primary outlets is to publications, either journals or station publications. But we also sometimes do demonstration work. So, for example, at Blacks Mountain Experimental Forest, we have a couple of projects. I won't say a number, but a couple of projects that are really they're more for demonstration, right? So there's really nothing we can publish on here. We don't have enough replication, things like that. But maybe we've done some things that compare and contrast treatment A, treatment B, and we put them side by side, and people can just drive up and look and say, here's a demonstration of two different ways of handling a problem. This is what they look like. And you can come by 10 years later, 20 years later, you can see how does it look? How's it going out here? So this is my way of kind of simplifying how the difference between demonstration and research. And so state of California has also, so we in the Forest Service have a network of experimental forests and experimental ranges. Most of them are experimental forests. And I think there's about, at last count, somewhere around 70 of those. I lose track because they kind of come and go, but there's about 70 of them. But then within the state of California, the state also has a network of what they call demonstration forests. And so they also do a combination of demonstration and research at those locations. So there's Boggs Mountain, Jackson, Latour. There's a couple others I'm forgetting, but Jackson is the largest. It's about 50,000 acres, as I recall. And so we've, as I mentioned earlier, we've had a pretty long, fruitful partnership going on down there at Jackson, which is in Mendocino County.
All right. You've mentioned quite a few research projects, certainly focuses of some of the original pioneers. Was there a particular research undertaking that you would say helped to mold or shape the station's future?
So that's a tough question. And I guess the way I would go is maybe take in a slightly different direction. One of the most influential bits of work that was ever done at the station, I think, was some work done by a guy named Lester Reinecke back in 1933. And he was only here for a few years. Lester had a really interesting career with the Forest Service, very long career, worked up until the 1960s. But he was only here for a short period of time. And he developed a thing called a stand density index. And that is, while during his time with us here at PSW, and that has turned out to be one of the most oft-cited pieces of research you'll find. To this day, it is tremendously influential, based on just some fairly simple observations that he made looking at different forest types. And one of the cool things about it was not California centric. It covered the whole lower 48, basically. Maybe more than one of the most influential things that was done for long term was that bit of work by Reinecke back in 1933.
Well, Martin, I and we, hopefully the listeners, appreciate all the information on the station history. But here's a question actually for yourself. So with your 35 years, what has been, kept you interested in not just the PSW aspect, but also the Forest Service during those decades?
Well, this has been a really fulfilling career for me. I've really enjoyed it. I got started in this niche in research kind of by accident. I was on my original career path. I was going to be a forester like my father was. My father spent a good chunk of his career, about 20 years, as the manager at Latour Demonstration State Forest, east of Redding here with CAL FIRE. And I used to go out in the woods with him. I cruised timber with him out there. One of my earliest reminiscences, and one of the things that got me interested in forestry, was he took me out to a landing one day when I was about 7, 8 years old, and I started hearing explosions going off, and I was stunned. He kind of got a smile on his face, and I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, we're shooting stumps today." And then he went on to explain that what they were doing is they were building a road, and they were blowing up stumps. And he was taking dynamite under stumps and blowing them up. And I thought, my gosh, what a great job you have. You get to blow things up in addition to everything else you get to do. And so that was kind of when I got kind of interested in forests and forestry. And so, I got to come to the station. I got to spend a good chunk of my career managing or directing what was going on at Blacks Mountain Experimental Forest, which was just a pure joy. I love that place. I love the history, and every day I get to spend out there is that's just wonderful, and that's one of the things I'll really miss. And I've also worked with just some really good people here in the Redding Lab over the years. I have some really fond memories of many people who come and go on, but really were just a joy to work with, and so when you're doing something you really enjoy and you're working with people you like, it's pretty good, and I got paid to do it. So I love the time I had here. It's been a great run, and then recently I just this last week or so, both my colleague Jean-Wei and I were given a distinguished service award with station, based to a large extent on a combined body of work that both of us have, just having been here a long time and worked on many different projects, and that was really a nice thing, and I think Jean-Wei and I both really appreciated that award. It was just nice to be recognized for the breadth of stuff that we've worked on over the years. I mean, for both of us, we both worked on a lot of different kinds of projects, and sometimes had to take our careers in maybe a little different direction. And as interest in certain topics changed, you have to kind of refocus your body of work and your research portfolio over time. And so I think that was kind of a recognition for both of us for that that aspect of the work that we've done here. And so I think we both really appreciated that.
So from blowing stumps, you've started a career.
Yeah,
You probably have one of the best
it was
entry
stories.
stories.
You go out in the woods and you hear somebody blow something up, it gets your attention right now.
Oh, I think so. I mean, everybody was like, "Oh, I went to college and then I went to a job fair." And I'm like, "No, you heard people blowing up stumps to make a road in the forest." I'm thinking, yeah, who would not go? I'm getting into this job career. That's great. Oh, hey, so where's Black? Is it Blacks or Black?
It is Blacks with an S.
Okay, Blacks Mountain. Where's that located?
Blacks Mountain is located in Lassen County on the Lassen National Forest. It's
Okay.
been there since 1934. It was carved out administratively from the Lassen. We have two experimental forests up there on the Lassen on the Lassen National Forest. Swain Mountain and Blacks Mountain, both created at about the same time. Swain was made in 1933. Blacks was set aside in 1934. And interestingly, those two experimental forests are the primary reason we have a Redding lab, was to have a research location close enough to access those two experimental forests. Those and the Challenge experimental forest. Redding is kind of a good launching place for those three experimental forests that we manage out of the Redding lab.
Challenge? What is that? What is Challenge?
So Challenge Experimental Forest
That's
is
another one.
Yes, I hadn't mentioned that before. And the Challenge is down just east of Oroville. It's a lower elevation, sort of a mid-elevation pine dominated with Douglas fir, sort of kind of a pine mixed conifer type of a situation down there. So it's a higher productivity west side type of forest, whereas when we get into up to say Blacks Mountain, that's a lower productivity east side type forest. So these are three distinctly different forest types that these represent.
You work out of Redding. Have you been to a lot of national forests? And is Lassen your kind of backdoor favorite?
Lassen's been the one where we've just done most of our work, and we've always had a great working relationship with the folks up there. But I've worked on probably most of the northern forests, with the exception of the Six Rivers in California, and quite a few of the forests in Southern Oregon as well. I haven't done much work in Southern California, though. So when we get down to like on the Angeles, San Bernardino, places like that, I don't have much familiarity with that at all.
So you mentioned that Distinguished Career Award. That I'll reveal that you are approaching retirement. There's no set date, and who knows when that will be. But you received the award from the Regional Forester and Research Station Director Honors Awards ceremony that happens each year. So congratulations on that. So just as we end the show here, some thoughts about getting into this career path. Any kind of words of wisdom, if you will, for listeners saying this sounds like I would love to be at 35 years in my career and be able to say the same thing as Martin Ritchie.
I guess if I was going to give some advice, it might be to seek out a way to get some experience on the ground before one committed oneself to an educational path. It's nice to know that you're comfortable, you're heading in the right direction. I did 7 years of wildland firefighting before I got into finishing a degree and then going on to grad school and doing all of that. And that really helped me a lot, even though I don't do anything like putting out fires anymore. That experience led me to really have a good idea of what I didn't want to do for the next 30, 40 years. I didn't want to be putting out fires. that didn't appeal to me very much. But the forestry side of things did, and so I had a really good feel going into it, rather than just jumping from high school into a career, selecting a career and then pursuing a degree. I really think if there's a way to kind of, I don't know, do something like an apprenticeship or do some work related to where you think you might like to be going before you commit to, a considerable expense of a college degree. And when I went to college back in the old days, it was still fairly inexpensive. Took a fair amount of my time, but it didn't take a whole lot of dollars actually. So, and nowadays, of course, educations are very expensive. So you really need to make sure you've picked the right one and not be flopping around and changing. I think I chose the wrong field. So that would be my find a job that's an entry-level job where you're out in the woods and see if you really do enjoy it, and if you think that's something you'd like to do for the rest of your life.
Well, it's been quite a ride. Thank you, Martin Ritchie, research forester, and probably more pointedly, the historian for the research station, if you will. Thank you for taking us on this journey, and again, good luck in your, I'm sure, a very difficult decision of when to actually retire from an excellent job. And we appreciate your time on the show.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
Wow, over 2 hours. Well, that's why there are play and pause buttons. Thanks to Francisco, Sylvia, and Martin, and to AJ Moses at the research station for connecting us with these three very different but equally interesting employees to start, hopefully, a continued look into the personnel who work at our Pacific Southwest Research Station. Thanks for listening. For those who are curious to learn more, go over to the show description page and click on the links. To find more episodes, search for Forest Focus Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have any questions or suggestions for the show, email us at sm.fs.r5ffpodcast@usda.gov. Until next time, enjoy your public lands. Please remember to recreate responsibly, know before you go, and learn what you can do to prevent wildfires. Take care. This podcast is sponsored by the USDA Department of Agriculture, Forest Service, and the USDA is an equal opportunity provider, employer, and lender.